Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-hosts, Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Dr. Peter McCullough. Peter, I left the R off, McCullough. He is an internist, cardiologist, and professor of medicine at Texas A&M. Dr. McCullough, welcome to the show.
Yeah, I have to correct you. I've been stripped of that professorship at Texas A&M.
Oh, wow.
Maybe we need to talk about that. But there's a lot of things that we want to talk about. Shamika's really excited about asking you about all types of things. But in listening to what you try to make people aware of, I think it's the most important thing. I want to start with it because it's the thing that we least heard about. I don't think I heard about it until I heard one of your talks. And it's not about masks. It's not about vaccinations. Not about even the government response, really. It's about the fact that COVID was treatable. And that's a pretty massive blow. So I want to talk a bit at the beginning here about what you mean by it was treatable, when people knew, how soon we knew, and if it was early, why have most people not heard about that?
Yes, it's such a good point. I think that's really what Americans wanted to know from the very beginning. If I got the illness, what should I do? Americans needed a care plan. And I think it was an absolute blunder that our federal agencies, hospitals, health systems, medical schools, they never had a care plan for patients if they were to get the illness. They actually never had public forums to have people ask questions. Think about this. We're a third year into it, and none of the medical schools have ever had a public forum and have people come in and get their questions answered. We've had the biggest health event in the modern history of our country, and it's been zero on the most fundamental things. How could we actually have a pandemic that caused 10 million hospitalizations, 1 million deaths, and there's never been a care plan of what do you do when you get a positive test? I mean, it's absolutely stunning.
Right. And still to that day. So Will, Shamika, either of you, what do you want to say about that piece particularly? About the fact that no one talks about that. It was all about mass vaccination, death rate, everything else political, but nothing about, well, what do we do? Am I wrong that a lot of that was missing? Did you all notice that as well?
Yeah, I noticed it. My daughter got sick early on, probably like the end of February, beginning of March 2020. They did a flu test that was negative. They did strep throat that was negative, but she could not breathe. Like, she was really struggling. It was the sickest she had ever been, but no one had an answer for her. Fast forward, there never was any answer. So it was like when other people began to get sick, it was, okay, they're not going to be able to do anything, or they're not going to treat it, especially, they did end up giving her, I think it was Zithromax or something, and eventually, because she just wouldn't get better. And but later on, when other people started to get sick, it was almost like, well, you need to come in and get a test. And it was like, why? Because you're going to say there's nothing you can do. You have to wait it out. And if you get too bad, then, of course, then you have to be hospitalized and put on a ventilator. And it's like, what's the in between for that? Like, there has to be something that you all are using to treat this, but it just never seemed as if anything was good enough. And when you heard people talking about things like ivermectin or hydrochloroquine or whatever it was, they said that wasn't good enough for you. So it just really seemed to be really strange that nothing was good enough, but they just wanted you to sit home and be sick. I've never heard of that. Even with the common cold, there's something that they want you to take. With the flu, they have Theraflu and all of these other things. But with this, they just wanted you to sit home and wait it out or die.
I found it notable that none of our blue ribbon organizations, Harvard, Duke, Northwestern, UCLA, none of them even had a clinic for COVID patients to go. Here we had millions upon millions of Americans, getting sick, and the best that could be offered would be a test, a test. Well, a test doesn't get somebody better. A vaccine doesn't get somebody better. A mask doesn't make people feel better. So there was a complete lapse on treatment. So let me tell you what happened. It's in my book, Courage to Face COVID-19, Preventing Hospitalizations and Deaths While Battling the Biopharmaceutical Complex. It's a bestseller, multiple categories on Amazon. And I wrote it with John Leake, best-selling true crime author. We lay it out from the very beginning. So when this hit, within a few weeks, as a medical doctor, I said, I was on these task force calls with major health, my academic center. I said, we're going to start treating this. I mean, people are going to start to get hospitalized. We got to get off the dime and start treating patients. We got to figure this out. And the doctors just headed for the exits. There wasn't a single doctor who said, yeah, we should do it. I think the doctors were afraid of catching the illness themselves. They were truly afraid. I think the hospitals actually didn't want patients to come in and contaminate things. That's what was going on. So in the month of March of 2020, I worked with the FDA and got an investigation on drug application. I got a big grant. We studied how to prevent it in healthcare workers, and then we tested some outpatient treatment protocols at some practices, and then published our findings there. Peter Navarro from the White House reached out to me. This is in the spring of 2020. Said, "Hey, listen, I learned you figured out how to treat COVID." I said, "Yeah, we've got a good handle." And it's myself, Vladimir Zelenko in Monroe, New York, George Freed and Brian Tyson, South Central California, was John Littell in Florida, Didier Rialt in France, Pierre Corey and Paul Merrick separately in Virginia and in Milwaukee. So basically people separately around the country and around the world figured out how to treat it. The principles were this: a single drug was not going to work. We don't even treat a staph infection with a single drug. So one drug was out. We knew it was going to take multiple drugs. We needed drugs to cover viral replication, drugs to cover inflammation or the cytokine storm, and then microthrombosis, because what was killing people was blood clotting. And we learned from what was going on in the hospital. I published the very first paper teaching doctors how to treat COVID-19 in August of 2020. To this day, it's the most frequently downloaded and read paper in that journal on COVID-19, the American Journal of Medicine, and it received a lot of fanfare. By October of 2020, we had a home treatment guide that was put together by the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons. And then Ron Johnson really took over in the U.S. Senate. So he was going nuts, saying, listen, we got to treat the illness. He held the first set of Senate hearings on treatment in May of 2020 with Pierre Corey on steroids, largely for inpatients. And then the big one was November 19th, 2020, where I was the lead witness in the U.S. Senate, Harvey Risch from Yale and George Freed from California. George Freed, formerly Harvard trained, used to work under the National Institutes of Health. And we told America, listen, we figured this out. We can treat the illness. This was quickly followed up on December 8th, 2020, second set of hearings. Pierre Corey, JJ Roster, who had done the biggest study in Florida using ivermectin. And so we had it down. And so these protocols went forward. The leading ones were called the McCullough protocol or the FLCC protocol. And what happened towards the end of November and December is a bunch of telemedicine services kicked in. And we said, listen, if the medical schools and the doctors aren't going to do it, it's going to be done by telemedicine. And it was done. One of the biggest ones is called myfreedoctor.com. They provided care to patients in every state. It was a free charitable service. Patients could make a donation if they wanted to, and they get the drugs prescribed in. And, the protocols, evolved over time. Now they're very sophisticated. They use hydrogen peroxide or iodine to wash the nose and kill the virus there, nutraceuticals and supplements, an antiviral. Everyone's been focused on the antiviral, probably not the most important part of the protocol, but it evolved from hydroxychloroquine to ivermectin, Paxlovid, molnupiravir. People hyper-focused on that for some reason. We use doxycycline or azithromycin when there's a lot of phlegm, inhaled budesonide, oral prednisone, oral aspirin, oral colchicine, and then high-risk senior citizens blood thinners. And the main thing was that this was a long illness. The average adult would be 10 days of treatment during the first few waves of the pandemic. Thankfully, we never overflowed our hospitals. We got pretty close in December of 2020, January 2021. It was thought that the early treatment approach basically saved America. Now, looking backwards, if we would have had everybody jump on early treatment based on the learning curve, and I've testified in the Senate on this, we could have saved 2/3 of 1 million lives lost, and we could have spared 2/3 of 10 million hospitalizations that were unnecessary. The only people who are hospitalized or died are those who received no or inadequate early treatment.
Wow. Will, what would you like to say about some of this stuff?
Yeah, I think obviously the doc summarized the medical side of that better than I or we could. So I guess a comment and then a question. But I noticed some of the same patterns in sort of a regional leadership role early in COVID. I remember talking. This is a conversation that was actually on just a media podcast with Dan Crenshaw, the congressman. But I asked him why there hadn't been some kind of randomized test of people for COVID antibodies so we'd know what the actual IFR, the infection fatality rate, was for COVID. And this was something that a lot of people were watching, and that I got feedback from people who were politically involved on it at a decent level. And there was never really an answer to the question. So, there was this entire debate going on, like Ianitas versus the medical mainstream. If you were reading, I read some of this literature in my academic role about how deadly COVID was, or how you could respond to it. And there didn't seem to be a very competent attempt looking at it, whether as the ombudsman for a university or looking at it as someone that was producing some of this media content, to answer these questions. And that, when you mentioned the lack of a treatment protocol, I'm not a medical doctor, but that seems like the most basic response to a novel disease. Please correct if that's wrong.
Right. That would be the first thing you think of is how do you treat it? The first thing you think of wouldn't be masks or vaccines. Yeah. But, in our book, we chronicle, I'm in Dallas, Texas, and our Dallas County judge, who's, basically a Dallas County executive, the third most powerful person in the state, Clay Jenkins, early in March issued an order. Actually, it was a Dallas County emergency order. It said we must shelter in place. Shelter in place. This is like there's a nuclear holocaust, as if bullets are flying outside. Shelter in place until there's a vaccine. Now, how did he know there was going to be a vaccine? You think about this. It was extraordinary. In fact, from the very beginning, do you know within 3 days of the crisis being announced as a crisis, within 3 days, do you know Moderna said, we have a vaccine?
Yes.
Within 3 days.
Yeah, well, not at all to jump in there, but I think that might be how government officials knew there was going to be a vaccine. The announcement that the mRNAs were out there, with all the flaws that they wound up with at the end, but that they were out there, came within a week. You said 3 days. My understanding is that it was sort of the governmental bureaucracy that stopped the vaccines from getting out there for months. But I guess my question to you, though, when you look at the IFR question, or when you look at whether or not to revisit all these debates, but the ivermectin conversation, the hydroxychloroquine conversation, no well-done randomized studies of any of this stuff, Doc, why not? I guess is the question.
Well,
why was there this reluctance?
Because if the government was basically saying that this crisis was going to have one answer, and one answer only, that was the vaccine, then the government would never invest in a large clinical trial of treatment. And when I mean large, we need about as big as the vaccine trials. We need 20 or 30,000 patients in a trial. You would never invest in a vaccine trial. You'd actually work with social media to try to dissuade any early treatment because you want the population to accept a vaccine. And then you would manage every other issue. You brought up one of them, which was antibodies. Did you know the in vitro diagnostic companies approved antibodies in order to detect prior exposure to COVID-19? That's what they're approved for. I ordered them in my practice. The FDA said, stop measuring antibodies. Stop measuring antibodies. Well, why would they actually tell you? These companies have FDA approval to do this. I mean, they did that because they didn't want people measuring antibodies, thinking they wouldn't need a vaccine.
Mhm.
Al, if you just take any question and you say, does the goal look like is to put a needle in every arm, in every person, every 6 months forever, then all the answers make sense. You would squash any early treatment, any of it. You would squash antibody measurement. You would squash any analysis on risk stratification. So a case fatality rates stratified, because you'd want to give the vaccine to everyone, right? So if the plan is to give a vaccine on everyone, everything makes sense. And in our book, actually, we highlight this, that the suppression of early treatment, or the suppression of doctors' attempts to treat patients, which was clear.
I have a silly, Shamika, don't forget your question. You were going to jump in, but I have a very naive, but seems like a really simple, logical next question. Maybe not from the, it's a partnership between the government and medical professionals, of course, but particularly from the medical professionals' point of view. You talked about early treatment, but isn't their number one goal the patient? It seems like the patient got lost here, because if you're focused on the vaccine, and we don't want people to be, reluctant to take it, so we want everyone to take it, so we incentivize them to take it. That's a separate debate. But that's when the vaccine is approved 6 months, 8 months, in most cases 2 years. They sped it along, but 18 months later. So what do we do with the people getting sick every day if we're more concerned about a vaccine than we are the people who are getting sick every day? I mean, CNN had a ticker, so they must have cared. They were showing you these numbers, but no one's actually caring for those people.
But if you really, if this is terrible to say, but if all you really cared about was the vaccine, you would intentionally let people get sick over and over again. And you would actually use everything you can to even further encourage them to take a vaccine.
Because that'll make them want to take it.
Make them, it's preparing the population for a vaccine. And we know this because in the Peter Breggin book, COVID-19 and the Global Predators, he highlights since 2012, 36 pandemic preparedness events, 25 of which generated documents. You can read them. 6 of them were filmed, including Event 201 and the others, where it said, we will do everything to railroad people into mass vaccination. It's laid out there. It's laid out there. And the treatment, and we outline in this, our book, Courage to Face COVID-19. Do you know that hydroxychloroquine was removed from the over-the-counter market in France months before the pandemic was even announced? Months before. Do you know in Queensland, Australia, I think the date is April 11th, 2020. They put on the books, if a doctor attempted to use hydroxychloroquine, the doctor would go to jail. And when I went on Tucker Carlson, I told him that. He goes, how did they know? The research wasn't even done with hydroxychloroquine then. How did they know? Why would they so strongly discourage any attempt to treat a patient? And you know the story. Doctors did try to help patients in the United States. They prescribed hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin or budesonide or colchicine, and then their licenses were reviewed. Some doctors got their licenses pulled. Doctors spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to defend their licenses because they were trying to help patients.
So I think it's important to be clear of who's the they, so people don't think it's the doctor. So who is it that wanted to railroad all of the Americans into taking the vaccine when it came out?
In our book, we outline these. These are the perpetrators, and we call it the biopharmaceutical complex. So when you look at the agencies or the organizations that said they want to vaccinate everybody, we'd start at the top, World Economic Forum. You would take the Gates Foundation, the organization they founded called S2-Ep, the Center for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, which is a vaccine development house. They formed that in 2017. Rockefeller Foundation, Wellcome Trust, Gavi, the Eco Health Alliance, the Chinese Communist Party, the CDC, NIH, and FDA, the White House Task Force 1 and 2, they made it very clear that's what they wanted. And that's the only thing they wanted. And from the very beginning, you look at the S2-Ep business plan, right? So they're prepared, pandemic preparedness innovation, 63-page business plan. Billions of dollars going to be pouring in from treasuries. They're going to farm them out to pharmaceutical companies. Not a mention of treatment. None. None.
Shamika, you remember what you were going to ask?
Yeah, I have a question. It's vaccine related. So if I understand this correctly, traditional vaccines would inject you with a live virus or maybe a virus that wasn't as strong, hoping that your body would produce antibodies to fight this. However, with the mRNA vaccine, what they're injecting you with is the spike protein, or injecting you with something so your body can create the spike protein with the hopes that the antibodies will then be produced to fight against that spike protein. Is that correct?
That's nearly correct. The basic vaccines that we've had, by the way, at my age, there were only 3 vaccines when I was a kid, 3. Now the kids get 70 shots. I mean, it is massively expanded. But they fall into categories of, you're right, a dead virus, okay, a live attenuated virus, so a virus that's disabled, it really can't cause the illness. And then the last part is a protein or antigen, like a tetanus shot is just an antigen. Hepatitis B is just the protein. But in all cases, the minimum time of safety observation is 2 years. With the messenger RNA vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, and then the adenoviral vaccines, Johnson & Johnson, and AstraZeneca, they're actually genetic products. It's the first time the human body has been exposed to foreign genetic material. So the foreign genetic material in all the products is loaded on lipid nanoparticles. So this is the first time we've given foreign genetic material and the first time we've given lipid nanoparticles. Now, papers from China by Wang and colleagues in 2018 clearly showed the lipid nanoparticles go into the brain. They go into the heart, the adrenal glands, the ovaries, and the testes. They showed this. This was known. So when we load genetic material and lipid nanoparticles, it is known they're going to go everywhere. That's very different than a tetanus shot. You get a tetanus shot in the arm, it doesn't go to the brain. It stays in the arm. You get a sore arm. Very, very different. So the genetic material loaded with lipid nanoparticles gets shot in the arm. Within an hour, it's in the bloodstream and it's circulating. And then it's distributed. So it goes right up into the brain, the adrenal glands, and the heart. And then it installs the genetic code for the spike protein. The spike protein is the lethal part of SARS-CoV-2. That's the dangerous part. It's the little bud on the surface of the ball of the virus. The ball is innocuous. It's the spike protein that was engineered intentionally through a U.S. research done by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the National Institutes of Health. Now, the work was done in the biosecurity lab in Wuhan, China, but that's where the work was done. And the spike protein was made intentionally so it would invade the human body. And this is laid out in publications by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 2015. First author is Menicheri, and in the title of the papers, it says emergence of SARS-CoV-2 into human populations. They were making it so it would invade the human body. They were also working on the vaccines and the monoclonal antibodies at the time. In fact, they were killed vaccines initially. So this is a US government operation done in the lab in China. How Moderna is involved is that Stéphane Bancel, the billionaire CEO of Moderna, previously was the CEO of bioMérieux. bioMérieux is a French conglomerate company that was commissioned by Jacques Chirac to build the biosecurity annex of the lab in Wuhan, China. So actually, Bancel helps the Chinese build the lab. And in 2015, he goes from bioMérieux to Moderna, a one-person company in Cambridge. And then Moderna writes the patent on the COVID-19 vaccine with the National Institutes of Health. That's the reason why they have the patent. That's how they did it. And it was done years before this was, basically released from the lab or broke out in the world. So
follow up, Shamika?
I
yeah.
did.
So let me just finish. So the spike protein, once the genetics are installed, the spike protein is produced in any tissue where the genetics are installed. And the spike protein then itself circulates in the body for about a month. Now, the what's known now, paper from Stanford by Holken and colleagues, shows that the genetic material is stuck in lymph nodes for at least 2 months, if not longer. They've actually never shown that it goes away. The spike proteins in the body for over a year, work by Bruce Patterson and Incel DX has shown this. So when people take these shots, it is a long-term installation of genetic material and spike protein. The spike protein independently now in 1,000 papers has been shown to damage the brain, the heart, the bone marrow, has been shown to cause blood clotting and inflammation. That's what we know about these products right now. And none of it, as you can tell, sounds good, and it's not.
Yeah, that was my part of my question as well. So when you said initially you had to treat 3 things, the inflammation, the viral replication, and the blood clots, how then does this, I understand how the vaccine could help with or supposedly help with the inflammation and the viral replication, but how would it ever help the blood clotting?
No, the vaccine, and I published an op-ed on this in the summer of 2020. I saw this coming. I published it in the Hill. There's never been a vaccine that we give in the arm that protects against anything in the nose. Never. Nothing. It was no chance that this was going to work.
Wow.
There was no chance because it's a nasal infection. The nose relies on IgA and cells in the nasal cavity. You can't give a shot in the arm and accomplish that. Now, if they gave a nasal mist, yeah, that had a chance, but a shot in the arm was doomed to failure to begin with. And we know this, the pneumococcal vaccine, the 13-valent pneumococcal vaccine published in JAMA, its protection against hospitalization and death is only 9%. It's basically useless. Flu vaccine last year, 16%. It's basically useless. Anything that gives less than 50% protection actually should not be taken because it can only really cause side effects and can't help. So I knew from the start as a doctor, these were doomed to failure, and I published it. I made it very clear that they were doomed to failure. We later on found out papers by Chow, by Accorsi, Acharian, and Ribmarisma, they showed equal amounts of virus in someone who took a fully vaccinated versus somebody unvaccinated. It made no difference. The vaccines didn't do anything to the viral replication in the nose.
Will?
The vaccines' only hope, theoretically, is that the antibodies to the spike protein could intercept some viral replication in the body. But since the spike protein causes inflammation, and it's on the surface of the virus causing inflammation, actually the vaccines would make inflammation worse in the site of an infection. And since the spike protein causes blood clotting and the spike protein on the virus causes blood clotting, in fact, the vaccines would make blood clotting worse in the setting of someone who had the infection. So the vaccines were it was an extremely high gamble that they would ever actually stop the infection. And it was likely that they would make things worse if somebody got it.
If you got COVID or
Right.
okay.
Will, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I actually have kind of 2 quick questions here. I mean, first, Dr. McCullough, what do you think? I guess the first question would be something along the lines of, what do you think happened here? I mean, what you seem to be saying is that power players around the world, like the World Economic Forum, wanted everyone in the world to take this particular vaccine or close to that number. And you're noting some side effects of the vaccine, the spike protein, which can itself be hypothetically dangerous, travels throughout the human body and so on. This ties into the idea. I mean, you mentioned, for example, that COVID-19 was quite likely developed in a Chinese lab. I've read some of the academic debate about this, but I mean, do you think that there's some kind of behind the scenes conspiracy to inoculate the world with these vaccines and in response to a disease that was itself released by the elite or something like this. What's the motivation from a political science perspective? I mean, who's trying to do this, I guess, would be kind of the first question that comes to mind.
First off, let's try to agree on what you think the plan is. Do you think governments around the world did want to vaccinate their entire population?
Well, I think it depends. Like, I would actually, my honest opinion, so the second part of this question also, I mean, the CDC today, whatever you might think of the CDC, released some of their vaccine efficacy data. And this was debated on Twitter and on my social media. And their argument, first, my initial reaction to this is that if you're reasonably healthy, you have a very low chance of dying from COVID-19 in the first place. But looking at these numbers, if I recall them correctly, the death rate from COVID right now, given natural immunity at the levels it exists at and so on, if you were unvaccinated, was 13.94 individuals per 100,000. And if you were fully vaccinated and quote unquote boosted, it was 0.88 per 100,000. This may be a bit off. So, I mean, my impression would be that most people, for example, I've met the governor of Kentucky, who are in political leadership roles, would assume that the vaccine would probably work fairly well on the basis of this data and would be interested in vaccinating people. And that itself varied around the world. I mean, you're obviously seeing dramatically different positions in, Sweden as versus Japan as versus Hungary, so on down the line. But I think the majority of leaders probably would prefer that many people would be vaccinated. But who do you think the they are is kind of the academic question that I have. You mentioned you gave this answer, but
yeah, but let's get back to my question. Let's just take the United States. Do you think that leadership in the United States wanted every single person to take a vaccine and boosters?
Can I ask a quick question? Do you mean at the beginning?
I'd say at any time.
I think it really varies with the leadership. I mean, Ron DeSantis, no.
I would have guessed no.
Harris, probably.
Okay, but let me ask you this. Let me ask you this much. Let's restrict it to White House Task Force, CDC, and NIH and FDA.
Okay, now yes. Yes.
Now, are there any groups that are exempt? Has anybody gotten an official exemption? Say, listen, you don't need the vaccine. You're good.
Well, I think if you're talking about White House level administrative leadership, particularly during left-wing administrations, I mean, like if you're talking about Fauci and those that recommended what we actually ended up doing in response to COVID, yes, I think the basic idea would be that everyone should be vaccinated.
Okay. As long as we have that established.
But
so
most
I agree
people,
with you.
most of our elected officials were followers, though. I think they were like, this is what we're told by these 6 people and these 4 organizations. We trust them, so let's do it.
Yeah, but I guess the question is, I think at a certain point, we do have to ask what, Dr. McCullough, you do think is going on here. I mean, what do you think, if you're talking about the WF, for example, the Klaus Schwab boys, why do you think they wanted to vaccinate the world? Do you think that was to fight against COVID-19?
Yeah, the thing is, it's impossible to ask somebody else to assign motive of what people's motive. The best thing to do is ask them. Have you ever seen anybody ask Fauci or anybody, why does everybody have to be vaccinated?
Oh, you can't ask him because he would lie. He was asked, did he ever say he would that the lockdowns were good? Won't you admit that that's a mistake? And he said, no, I was never for lockdowns.
No, but I'm saying at any time, because the point that Wilfred's making is that, listen, it's not an equal opportunity killer, right? And for vaccines, we never apply the same vaccine in everybody at the same time down to 6 months. Never. It's always a risk stratification. Right. So what Wilfred's asking is, well, is that really the goal? Was the goal of the CDC, NIH, and FDA to get every single human being in America vaccinated without exceptions? I think the answer is yes, because we never got anything that say, listen, if you're young and you're healthy, you're free and clear. No one was ever free and clear. No one in the military was ever free and clear. Do you know what I mean? Everybody right. was fighting for their own exemption. So
young people, athletes, everybody. Yeah, you're right.
So
I almost want to say no. Excuse me. I want to say no. I can't believe that. But what's stopping me is, even if you wanted to give people a pass at the beginning and say there were unknowns, it's the fact that we talked recently that I'm in New York and the mayor of New York, as recently as 2 months ago, was strongly considering mandating vaccinations for everyone in school. At that point, you have no excuse. You can't say you don't know the efficacy is lower than you thought. You don't know side effects, and you're still trying to vaccinate everyone. The only reason he backed off of that is because of the CDC's recent information they released. But before that, he was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure come September, I'm going to mandate that everybody gets vaccinated. Now, why would you do that at that point, 2 years in?
Yeah,
Well,
didn't DC
DC
mayor
did
just
actually.
do
Yep,
that?
DC
Yeah,
did.
they did mandate this, and look, something like 40% of Black kids would have been unable to attend school. Though
That's
this is probably the
shocking.
last question for me. Although
No, but
that
let
is a
me
crazy-
let's just finish the educational issue. So
Yep.
Eric Adams in New York is still saying, listen, the teachers have to take the vaccine.
True.
And if they don't, they're gone.
City employees, yeah. Mhm.
Right. So, but the idea is, what is in his mind that's making him feel this is very interesting psychology. Do you know there are, so obviously something in his mind is that no matter what the CDC says, no matter what anybody says, they have to take the vaccine. Let me give you just one other example.
Mhm.
Do you know there are some financial services companies where they're largely working from home now? They haven't come back to the office, and they are mandating a vaccine in every employee without exceptions. They're working from home.
Yep.
And do you know Starbucks, where there's people in there coughing all the time in their crowded little Starbucks shops, no vaccine mandate. What I'm saying is these vaccine mandates and the desire to get a needle in every arm by some do not appear to be related to COVID.
Right. No, I agree with that. But my concern is, you can talk about, many psychological types. You talk about psychological, what was in Eric Adams' mind, but psychologically, we know how the human mind works. You talk about, a herd mentality. I think these hardest push, like when you talk about financial institutions, Eric Adams, a lot of this stuff, whatever we think of, the White House team and the CDC, a lot of the people who are it's like I had an instance on an airplane in 2020, Will? I was going to meet Will. And I'm on an airplane and I had a mask on and I fell asleep and the mask came down to here and the flight attendant woke me up and told me she was going to have security waiting for me when we landed, and she did. So when I'm saying yes, so what I'm saying is the people at the top, these people who may have an ulterior motive, whatever that motive is, we should ask them, you're right. But then once you let that cat out of the bag, you can't control how people are going to react to it. So now you had all these little dictators that's going to enforce what they don't even understand. So I think when you talk about the school, Eric Adams, financial institutions, things of that like, now it's just, the horse is out of the barn and everybody just saying, well, I don't really care so they care what the CDC was saying before when they said it's bad, it's bad, it's bad. Now they're saying it's not as bad. Well, they don't really know. So I'm going to keep doing it anyway, just to make sure, out of an abundance of caution. It makes no sense, but I think that is separate from what the
can we get back to Wilfred's question about motive? So in our book, Courage to Face COVID-19, we do pick up on this, and we say it's true crime because the crime that's committed in our first book is the suppression of early treatment. That, no doubt about it,
right.
Vaccinated or not, suppression of early treatment led to excess deaths. There's no doubt about it. The vaccines have never been shown in a randomized trial with primary endpoint being hospitalization and death to reduce death or hospitalization. Never. In every study where they actually know who took the vaccines and they have hospitalization and death records, patients actually fully vaccinated do worse than unvaccinated.
To jump in just very quickly there. So where do you think, I think motive really is an interesting question here without rambling on too much. I don't think that there is I understand Moderna wants to sell medicines or drugs. I don't think there's a global conspiracy involving Eric Adams to vaccinate everyone in the country for reasons unrelated to COVID. And I don't say that sarcastically. But I mean, as a political scientist or a political psych, I mean, one of the things you notice is that Americans are terrified about all kinds of random crap. So like the average American woman thinks 10% of the population's died of COVID. I think that that has an effect on this kind of decision making. But kind of getting back to the point here, I mean, so when you say the vaccines don't reduce death, what are you saying about the numbers from sort of the CDC?
Yeah, so let me finish.
Are you saying these are all wrong, or?
Yeah. So let me finish. So I'm a clinical trialist. I'm the most published person in my field in the world in history. It's the reason why you're talking to me. I've published more scientific papers than anybody you can talk to, including randomized trials. The only way to make a claim that a vaccine reduces death is in a prospective, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. And the FDA never granted that claim to the vaccines because they never showed that. And so what we have is we have a situation of bias. So when we have people who took the vaccines and who didn't take the vaccines, they're different people. They're different people, okay? And when we had the CDC set up differential testing, when people showed up to the hospital, for the vaccinated and unvaccinated got more tests than the vaccinated. And we never had adjudication in these studies of why they're in the hospital, including adjudication of why they died. We set up studies, or I didn't set them up, but there are studies in the United States that are clearly invalid, making the claim that deaths occurred to a greater degree in the unvaccinated. To make things worse, most electronic medical records, I know, I just came from the hospital, their default setting is unvaccinated. So unless a patient really made the case that they're vaccinated and tried to bring in their vaccine card, these poor people on the ventilator, they're counted as unvaccinated. So huge amount of Americans in hospital were counted as unvaccinated when they were fully vaccinated. And we knew that was the case because as soon as the data started coming in from Canada, the EU, South Africa, Israel, it was just the opposite. The vast majority of people in the hospital and dying were fully vaccinated across the world. So the US had some biased data sets that are still being used in propagating this false narrative that the vaccines do something. Remember, they don't stop the infection from occurring. The CDC had so many breakthrough infections and deaths by May of 2021, they gave up. They said, we're not tracking these breakthroughs. We can't do it. It's too many. Then our CDC director came out and said they don't stop transmission. The final consolation prize was, well, even though they don't do anything else, they somehow reduce death. And I can tell you as a doctor that that's not tractable at all. Anything that would reduce deaths would reduce some cases to begin with. They don't do that. And so we ended up with basically this false claim. So it boiled down to the fact that, listen, you should take a vaccine. It's not going to help us from a public health perspective at all, but it's going to make you less likely to die. Well, how in the world can that be applied to a 6-month-old baby? You know that this whole campaign is basically built on something other than COVID. So let's just go to public utterances. It's in our book, and I think we should look at them. Bill Gates, 2010, says this should be the decade of the vaccines, that his return on investment is 20-1 makes vaccines. He said it. Bill Gates, around 2012, in a TED Talk says, mass vaccination could be a way of reducing the world's population. He said it. It's his words. Within a few months of the COVID-19 epidemic happening, Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum, writes a book, COVID-19 and the Global Reset. He wrote the book. The book says this is an opportunity to reset a new world order. I mean, these are public utterances. I mean, what does this syndicate, what does this biopharmaceutical complex really want? Well, you could just take them at face value.
Well, just if I can ask one thing about these death figures, I actually just pulled this up. United States COVID-19 weekly death rate by vaccination status. This came out a couple of days ago. Death rates are calculated as the number of deaths in each group divided by the total number of people in this group. This includes only people that have specifically stated their status as being one of the following: unvaccinated 13.62 per 100,000, primary vaccination plus booster 0.88. That's what we talked about earlier. You do not believe this is real?
No, it's not randomized. It's completely invalid. It's not randomized. It's not adjudicated.
Couldn't you just look at population and regress for the different characteristics, age and so on?
No, it's invalid for all the reasons I said. And if you pull up that same type of data source in another country, it's just the opposite. So you just know it's wrong.
Is there a country where, for example, within the same age group, there are more deaths among the vaccinated?
Yeah,
Like
United Kingdom.
Okay, so among similar people, you're more likely to die if you're vaccinated.
Right.
Oh,
Shamika? Go ahead,
Yeah,
Shamika.
exactly. And then go look in South Africa, go look in Denmark, go look in Canada. I mean, there's a recent one from Ontario Health Statistics. 90% of people dying of COVID in Canada are fully vaccinated.
Look it up while you're doing that, Will. Shamika's going to
Well,
ask
I
a question.
actually
Right,
have
because
looked
I
up
got
some
a
of this stuff.
question.
Yeah, Shamika, sorry.
Yeah, so
I normally stay quiet.
Wilfred, you have to let go of this. Without a randomized trial showing a reduction in death, all these data are subject to bias, and that's the reason why they don't agree worldwide. It's not legit. The vaccines don't save lives. I'm telling you, as somebody, I'm the most qualified epidemiologist you're going to talk to. They don't save lives.
Why do so many other epidemiologists disagree?
I've never heard someone directly disagree with me.
Um,
Nobody's ever sent me an email. No one showed up in the U.S. Senate floor. No one.
I mean,
No
I've
one.
heard it. I mean, my doctor disagreed. Like, I'm pretty sure Fauci disagrees.
Well,
Like,
The
listen,
doctor
Wilfred,
didn't tell him.
Wilfred,
Oh my
tell
God,
your
let Shamika
doctor.
speak.
Listen, Wilfred, tell
Tell him
your
to send you an
doctor.
email?
Wilfred, tell your doctor about Steve Kirsch's offer. You know, Steve Kirsch, the millionaire, has said, listen, any doctor thinks these vaccines work. Any one of them, come out and let's have a public discussion. He'll pay him $1 million. No one will come. 2 million, nobody. 5 million. I made Steve put this on the Senate record. $10 million or name your price. Not a doctor will come out and defend these vaccines and say they reduce death and we should take them. So go find your doctor. I'm telling you, you're
I
looking at a
guarantee
house
you
of
that if
cards.
there's a man putting up $10 million to defend the COVID vaccines, I can find a doctor to try for the prize. But I mean, again, I think that
Oh my God,
this
please.
is a
let
public
Shamika-
offer. This is
what
one
is
of the most
Shamika-
public offers ever. You can't find him. Go find somebody.
I've
Unless
never
he's
heard about
living
this
under a
offer
rock. This is
before.
the most public offer ever.
Yeah. I mean, I will say doing things like fair in medicine and so on, and obviously I'm not at all mocking your credentials, but I mean, I've heard a good number of doctors recommend taking the COVID-19 vaccine. And while acknowledging that the studies are imperfect, still pointing out that you're seeing 1/10 the rate of death among vaccinated people as among unvaccinated people. So I'll ask a few of them again and see if they want to try for the 10 mil, but you know, an interesting point.
Well, I'm just telling you, the vast majority of doctors took these vaccines.
Yes, that is correct.
96% of doctors took the vaccines without asking anything about what's in them. Let me tell you
find
what.
it significant that 96% of doctors took the vaccine?
Yes, I think it's very significant. And they took it with no critical thinking. Now we're seeing this avalanche of vaccine deaths and injuries, and these doctors psychologically cannot manage. And that's the problem. That's the reason why they won't come out and defend the vaccines. That's the reason why they won't even send me a difficult email, let alone get into a conversation. I can tell you right now that this idea that they're going to try to tell their patients to take the vaccines, but they won't come out and publicly defend them, that is shameful.
Shamika Michelle, please.
Thank you. Finally, I beg to have Dr. McCullough on here. Normally I sit quiet and I let y'all bogart and take over the conversation, but I have some questions that I want answered, and this is my opportunity. So I feel like I'm being punked. Does Shamika have angry Black woman in her to finally say something? I do. Be quiet so I can ask my questions.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, thank you, Dr. McCullough. Sorry you had to see that. So I know a young lady who is vaccinated. She is 16 years old. She was just diagnosed with sickle cell. So my question is, could this possibly be from the vaccine? Because I've had 3 children. I know that they were tested when they were born. I know that I was tested prior to make sure I didn't have the trait. Do kids go to 16 years of age and then all of a sudden be diagnosed with sickle cell anemia?
No, I mean, the screening should be good from birth, but to my knowledge, there's no data that the vaccines cause sickle cell. I think a vaccine could be disastrous in giving to a sickle cell patient because sickle cell develops micro blood clots in the lungs, and the vaccine, you know, in theory could really worsen that. So if I had a sickle cell patient, I would treat them if they develop COVID, but I wouldn't suggest a research vaccine.
Okay, and I posted that you were going to be here, and I have some other questions. So we have people who want to know, how long they have to live. Now, do you think so that people are really afraid now at this point? So they want to know if they have the first and second shot, do you recommend, staying away from the boosters? Can they reverse this mRNA vaccine? I'm trying to put all of these questions in one. Can they reverse them? Should they be worried about contact with vaccinated people, like sexual contact? Yeah.
Let them go with those.
Let me just take that. So people are seeing large numbers of Americans die with the vaccine. There's no doubt about it. It's creating almost mass panic. Every day you hear about another public figure dying.
Is it large to the percentage of people who are vaccinated though, or just?
Well, I mean, but put it this way, any medical product that comes on the market after a handful of deaths, you should be pulled off. Something's wrong with it. 5, no more than 50. I've chaired data safety monitoring boards. Pfizer knew about 1,223 deaths within 90 days of release of their product. That's in the court-ordered documents. And the FDA tried to block that to America for 55 years. That's in the court proceedings. So the FDA is involved in an active cover-up now, and all the companies have had massive numbers of deaths. The CDC on their record say among Americans that they'll certify is between 13 and 14,000 have died, and those reports come in within a couple of days of the vaccine. There's a paper from Columbia through December that estimates the real numbers about 187,000 through December. If the underreporting is 100 to 1 or 50 to 1 or 21, these spontaneous reporting systems, it's grossly underreported. It's a fair estimate to say hundreds of thousands of Americans have lost their life with the vaccine. Now, that's what's putting people on edge. That's the reason why people are protesting. The military is walking away. We've never protested over the meningococcal vaccine or hepatitis B vaccine. People are protesting over the COVID vaccine because they're seeing large numbers of people die. Now, having said that, there's no way to get it out of your body once you take it. Most of the deaths occur within a few days. Anything within 30 days from a regulatory perspective is due to the vaccine until proven otherwise. The farther away we get, it becomes less certain if the vaccine has contributed. The average number of months that have occurred before the death, right now, the estimate's about between 4 and 5. I went on Fox News and I told Dan Bongino, who's freaking out, he's taking 3 of them. I told him, listen, I'm following my patients carefully. If you've gotten past 12 months, and everything's fine, there's no problems, I honestly think that the danger window is gone. We know that the deaths are related to specific lots. It's not randomly distributed across all the vaccines. It's actually specific manufacturing lots.
That's interesting.
Oh, really?
Yeah, about 80 to 90% of it's linked right to specific lots. So the European Medicine Agency's application, Moderna was showing that there were vials where the genetic material degrades very rapidly, 55% or so degradation. The theory here is that 85% of people take the vaccines, nothing happens to them. That was the Zogby survey data. 85% of people take the vaccines are fine. 15% have some new disease or some problem that they've gotten from the vaccine. Of the 85%, the leading thinking is they've gotten relatively degraded messenger RNA because they're using multi-use vials. They're not supercoating anymore. There's oxidation and air entered in. The lipid nanoparticles are frail. Most people, I think, are getting duds or relatively inactive shots.
Oh, great.
15% are getting probably high quality, high grade, high quantity messenger RNA or adenovirus DNA. They're getting the installation. And the cause of death clearly looks to be the spike protein. It's been found in the brain, the heart. The conclusion from the autopsies is the spike protein killed the patient. The spike protein caused the blood clot, which killed the patient. That's how the peer-reviewed literature is. So there's no way to get it out of your body. If you're more than a year, I think you're good. Keep taking boosters. I think it's you're stepping up to that Russian roulette table again. And wrong person, wrong time, wrong lot. It's going to be fatal. We've clearly seen deaths on the 3rd and 4th shots.
If I can ask, when you say that 187,000 people have died from the COVID vaccine, are you referring to this Jessica Rose article using VAERS data?
No, it's Pantazatos and Seligman, and that was using, it was an ecological analysis. It's using vaccine administration data and U.S. Census data. There's many sources of information that can be used. One source in the lawsuit against the government was to actually use the CMS data. So in
Right.
CMS, we know when somebody was vaccinated and we know when they died. So one can draw a very narrow time window. I think in the lawsuit, they drew 5 days.
I
And
pulled
so
this up
because
actually. I searched this just briefly, like Google Scholar, and the things to pop up are things like Reuters fact check. VAERS data is fairly unreliable and does not suggest COVID-19 vaccines killed 150,000 people or 187,000 people as analysis claims. Articles widely shared on social media claim more than 150,000 people have died from COVID vaccines. This is all based either on VAERS or simply assuming that all deaths occurring within X time of taking the vaccine are caused by the vaccine. Are you making a different claim there that there's?
are you making a claim that an anonymous, uncredentialed fact checker is credible?
I think that the doctors they're citing may well be. Now, if I were actually reviewing this, I'd have to look through all of the articles pro and con. I would be very surprised to find, in general, I mean, obviously you're highly credentialed in your field. In general, I would be surprised to find that one person discovered that 200,000 people had been, say, murdered by the government and no one else had discovered this. But you never know.
Well, let me tell you what, there are a lot of people have discovered it. Would you also discount that Pfizer has in their regulatory documents 1,223 deaths reported to them by family members within 90 days of release of their vaccine?
That sounds more plausible. The question that I would have about that is, so my understanding is that all of this comes from specific data sources, as would be the case anywhere. So most of this is VAERS reporting, right? Where individuals.
No, it's not. VAERS is grossly underreported. So what was reported to Pfizer, you can just take that. Listen, Pfizer released their product. People reported large numbers of people dying to Pfizer within 90 days. So really by February 1st or February of 2021, the death count was rising, and Pfizer actually in their internal documents hired 600 people to just man the phone calls. I can tell you, this is in the Public Health and Professional website because it was a lawsuit and Pfizer had to produce these documents.
I got to say really quickly.
So whether if you look at Pfizer, the Center for Medicaid Services, VAERS, U.S. Census data, you can look at all-cause mortality coming in from the life insurance companies, or go overseas and look at all the different data sources. They're cohesive.
Well, I've looked at some of this, and I would agree we've had a lot of excess deaths, but we also locked down the country idiotically for a year. So people weren't going to cancer appointments and so on. So I guess the question would be causation. How can you demonstrate that the vaccine caused these deaths? Would an unreliable vaccine within 90 days cause 1,000 deaths?
Here's the way that causation would be determined. It would be determined for what's called the Sir Austin Bradford Hill criteria. If we apply these, this will be the last thing I'm saying because I'm going to be out of time, and I can tell that you are probably getting a little nervous, and I think you should. And,
really.
And it'd be great for you to kind of do your own fact checking here, because this is really alarming. When we release a product to Americans, and large numbers of people die and report it to the pharmaceutical company, and the FDA tries to cover it up and the company doesn't do anything, that's for sure. That's 1223. And then it explodes across the country. We would apply these criteria. Number one, we'd ask the question, is it biologically plausible that this vaccine could kill a human being? The answer is yes, because the spike protein is known to be lethal. The answer is yes, because in published cases, when autopsies are done, the conclusion has been the vaccine caused somebody. So that's first criteria. Second criteria, you'd say, is it a large signal? Is it just happening in a few people, or is it happening in many people? The answer is across the world, it's happening in many, many people. The third criteria is it temporally associated? The vast majority of deaths occur within a few days of taking these, in a few days, about 50% within 48 hours, about 80% within a week. The next criteria is it internally consistent? Do we see near misses like strokes, heart attacks, other blood clots, Guillain-Barré syndrome, things that are known to be potentially fatal? Yes, the FDA agrees these things occur. Our FDA agrees that these complications occur. The next criterion, is it externally consistent? Is it being seen in the yellow card system and the UDRIS system and the VigiSafe system or WHO? Yes, it's externally consistent. I can tell you, last question, randomized trials. The biggest randomized trial program we have is Pfizer. there's slightly more deaths with Pfizer just over a couple months than with placebo. It's clear that these criteria are met on a more probable than not basis. The vaccines are leading to large numbers of death, and probably actually on a more certain than not basis, on a legal basis. This is a global catastrophe. That's the reason why the World Council for Health has said, pull them off of the market. Pull them off the market. There's been strong calls along the way to pull them off the market. There is a massive layer of internet technology and fact checkers. Most of them go back to the Gates supported Poynter Institute that are fact checking things. So innocent people like you Google this and you read something else, and you read an uncredentialed fact checker and you think, wow, it's not true. But then we see the next person die. That's the tension that's in the country. Listen, if this was the meningococcal vaccine or hepatitis B vaccine, we wouldn't have military walking off the job. We wouldn't have people losing their jobs. We wouldn't have people in Europe putting massive poster boards of all the people who have died after the vaccine across the rivers. We wouldn't have the tensions that we have in these countries if the vaccines weren't leading to large numbers of deaths.
Well, I have one last thing I got to bring up. I wish I could go back to Shamika. Don't get mad at me, blame Will. But I do want to say that earlier when I introduced you, I talked about your professorship, and you said that was stripped. And I'm reading your wiki, the Wikipedia page on you, and it says nicely that you're an American cardiologist. But then it says McCullough has promoted misinformation about COVID-19, the vaccine, and its treatments. So I want to know, I started with I said one, but really there's two for me. The biggest issue, all of the things we're debating here and talking about are very important. But I think the biggest concern with this is one, that no one talked about how to treat people. They didn't put the patient first. But the other one for me is, I don't think we learned anything. So I'm thinking if we go a year from now and something new happened, we will be in the same boat. And part of it is this, whatever we like Will and you are just having a conversation, he's asking you questions, but you're able to speak. The fact that people like you, credentialed people, are being blocked, having a license taken, losing their professorship. What does this say long-term when people are trying to get actual information out?
Well, look at this. As you know, one can't edit their own Wikipedia page. I tried, I was quickly locked out. Wikipedia page doesn't say that I was the first one to publish a treatment protocol on how to do this. It didn't say that I ultimately had one of the first investigational drug applications. The Wikipedia page is basically defaming, saying misinformation declared on what? Right. What's happening is people are being misled intentionally in one direction, is to take a vaccine every 6 months and anything. So listen, if I came out and said, listen, there's a problem with the vaccines, I'm worried. And I did ahead of time. I published ahead of time. I said, listen, these aren't going to work. These are potentially dangerous. Boy, did I put a target on my back, because there's an intention to get a needle in every arm every 6 months forever, down to 6-month-old babies without exception. And there appears to be no concern over how many people die all over the world.
Right. And in your defense, I read the full page. It never said anything that you said it was untrue. What it said was the stuff that you use, your videos, your commentary, was being used by people. And that has nothing to do with saying that what you're saying is not true, but that's the way it's set up. But I'm saying going forward, if we're allowing this, what happens 4, 5, 10 years from now when something else happens, and anytime somebody tries to point out problems, you get shut down? Isn't that the bigger issue going forward with?
Well, here's my final comment. I got to go on misinformation. Okay. In medical science, that's my field. There is no such thing as misinformation or information, and no one has agency over this. Mm-hmm. All we have is scientific data, and we have 2 or more interpretive points of view. And because we have these different that's how the science advances. The minute that a fact checker claims to have truth and somebody else doesn't have truth, and the fact checkers, that was a critical step that we knew something was wrong. We knew something was wrong. All we're doing is discussing scientific data. We're coming to our own conclusions. Right. Okay. We're coming. But the fact that, wait a minute, someone says, no, I'm actually right and you're wrong, and there's information and misinformation, that, by the way, that's just been passed, is going to go to the governor for California. California now, it's going to be, somebody's actually going to hold agency over information and misinformation. And of course, things evolve over time.
Right. And it doesn't go away. Guess we have to leave it there. He is Dr. Peter McCullough, internist, cardiologist, and the author of The Courage to Face COVID-19. Thanks a lot for your time, Dr.
Thank you. Bye-bye, you guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save because I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.